This video describes some of the common factors in interfacing the Opticom 760 card rack, 764 phase selector, 700 series IR detectors, and 768 auxiliary interface panel with traffic cabinets. Most newer traffic cabinets, whether TS2, 2070, ATC, include a detector rack that contains a slot for the Opticom 764 phase selector. However, there are some applications that require shelf-mounted cabinet components, whether within older TS1 cabinets or within agencies that require a separate preemption cabinet for housing Opticom 764 phase selector. In these cases, the 760 card rack would be required. When the 760 is used, the P1 harness is of particular importance. The P1 harness has 8 wires for connectivity within the traffic cabinet, including 120 volt hot, 120 volt neutral, 120 volt ground, 24 volt ground or logic common, and 4 discrete outputs for controller preemption input capability. Most controllers have at least 4 preemption inputs and can be programmed with preemption routines for servicing eastbound, westbound, northbound, and southbound EVP and TSP requests. The 4 uniquely colored outputs from the P1 harness are simply connected to the corresponding traffic controller preempt inputs, typically with spade connectors. Don't forget to also connect the 24 volt logic common wire to the corresponding logic common terminal block within the cabinet. Refer to your cabinet prints and controller manual for identifying the location of the preemption inputs within the cabinets and for programming preemption routines. For applications that don't require a 760 rack, the 4 discrete outputs for controller preemption input connectivity come out of the back of the 764 phase selector within the traffic cabinet's detector rack. In 330 series cabinets, 2 input file slots are typically used by phase selectors. These slots are usually J12 and J13 in the lower input file. You should verify that these are the slots that are mapped for EVP and TSP. They are pre-wired and have a direct association with a particular priority control input to the traffic controller. Both J12 and J13 supply 2 priority control inputs to the traffic controller. Most input files are cross-wired so that the 764 phase selector can be plugged into the rightmost J13 slot and use the inputs and outputs from the adjacent J12 slot. Since these slots are cross-wired, the inputs and or outputs may not behave as expected. It will probably be necessary to reassign the inputs and or outputs using the on-site software in order for them to appear on the expected channels. See the on-site help file or contact GTT tech support for more details. This is especially important in IR applications where you want to be backwards compatible with 754 phase selectors. For racks that are not cross-wired, you will need the Opticom 755 adapter card. This card has a ribbon cable which carries over the inputs and outputs from the adjacent card slot to the 764 phase selector. Similar to 330 series cabinets, NEMA TS2 and ATC cabinets typically have dedicated card rack slots for use by phase selectors. Some cabinets supply either 120 volt or 24 volt power in these slots. The 764 phase selector supports both voltages. There are some applications that may require the use of the 768 auxiliary interface panel or AIP. The AIP installation and usage video describes the most commonly used AIP capabilities. One of these includes generating turn signal specific outputs for providing the option for the controller to call a different preemption routine for left-turning vehicle movements versus straight-through and right-turning vehicle movements. If this behavior is required, be sure that the traffic controller is capable of supporting at least 6 preemption inputs if there are 6 or more phases in the intersection. Similar to the way the 760 card rack connections were described earlier, additional discrete connections may be wired using a 16 to 22 gauge wire between the 768 AIP TB2 terminal block and the corresponding traffic controller inputs. When using these AIP outputs, be sure to assign the outputs using the on-site software. Lastly, we will be reviewing inputs to the phase selector. For Opticom GPS applications, the intersection radio connects directly to the phase selector through the leftmost 11-pin connector on the front panel. However, for Opticom IR applications, connectivity of the 700 series detectors could vary depending on the cabinet type. For 760 card rack installation, wiring is straightforward with connections between the 760 series detector and the 760 card rack via the Opticom detector cable. However, for applications that don't use a 760, it will be necessary to consult the cabinet prints to ensure that the Opticom detector cable lands on the proper input terminal block location. This is very similar to the way inductive loop inputs are wired within the traffic cabinet. In both cases, it is strongly recommended that an earth-ground connection be made for the cables that go out to the field. These earth-ground connections will help protect the Opticom equipment as well as other equipment in the traffic cabinet. See the installation instructions for details on these earth-ground connections. For more information about cabinet and controller interfacing, please refer to the GTT customer portal or contact GTT Tech Support.